they're both $100, everybody said, well, might as well get the Class A, right? And so there's significant variations from state to state and from town to town. In California, there are some rural counties where judges were illegally crossing that off restraining orders, the gun provision. So if you're ever a recipient of a gun, of restraining order, you're not supposed to have a gun. But in California, judges were crossing it off. Some states, they actually don't have any enabling legislation for that, so that some states, you know, they don't actually have state laws that say, that instruct police to confiscate those firearms, like we do in Massachusetts, or for people to surrender those firearms. Some states, they say only guns that were previously used in a domestic violence crime. Some states, only guns that are visible to police. You know, they're very narrow. They hate the law, basically. And so they don't really want to enforce it. So here's Jackie Campbell. When there's a gun in the home, so this is the murder group. So of the women who were murdered, 65% of those cases, there was a gun either at his home or her home. Compared to the control group of battered women, there was a gun in those homes 24% of the time.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I ask a question? Femicide? Could you elaborate
So
on that?
femicide is the killing of a woman by a man. That's what femicide is.
Oh, and that you were talking femicide. That is a new term to me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I was curious. So when I interviewed these 31 killers, I asked them, would you have still killed her if you hadn't had your gun? And so 14 of the killers I interviewed had used a gun. And so you can see what their response, 11 of them said, no, they wouldn't have killed her if they didn't have a gun. And this is their answer, their reasons. Well, I was intoxicated. I didn't have the strength to stab her and choke her. It happened so fast, I would have come to that in the time it took to take out a knife. A gun depersonalizes. I wouldn't have gone through with it if I had time to think about it. And this is my favorite. I hate knives. I've been stabbed. So these guys basically are saying that a gun makes it easy, right? It just makes it easy. If you're impaired, if you're drunk especially, and you're angry, got a gun, you can do something about it, right? And so just the availability of a gun makes it easy. You know, it takes longer to choke somebody, to kind of like stab somebody. There is more opportunity to come to your senses. The youngest killer I interviewed was in Worcester, a 19-year-old, hadn't lived with his girlfriend. He had a separate apartment. On the night he killed her, they had been to a series of keg parties, and he ended up back at his apartment with his friends, but she ended up coming later. And she was angry when she showed up because he had stranded her at another party. And so she arrived and she started yelling at him. And he reacted by slapping her right in front of everybody. And his male roommate came between them and was trying to separate them. So this kid goes to his bedroom and he gets his assault rifle. And he comes back out and he says to his roommate, "You want to be a hero?" and shoots and kills his roommate. So then his girlfriend is yelling and screaming at him, and he's thinking, "Wow, I already killed one person." So he shoots and kills her. I asked him, would you have still killed them if you didn't have that gun? He looked at me like I had two heads, and he said, "There were 30 people in the apartment. How could I have stabbed them?" So there is a very clear case of two deaths that would not have happened were it not for the easy availability of a firearm. What would be his reason for having an assault rifle? He wasn't a hunter, even. That's not even a hunting weapon, by the way. You know, for having he was basically a jealous drunk with a gun. And so, how did they get the guns? 7 of them had legal possession. 4 of them had illegally purchased them. on the street, and three had failed to surrender. One of them actually went out and bought the night before he killed his wife, the day before, he drove to Maine, to York, Maine.
Watch it.
Stopped off at an antique shop and bought a Civil War era sidearm with black powder and musket. And that's what he used to kill his wife the next day. He could not legally own a firearm because he had 2 felonies on his record. The first felony occurred when he was in high school. He kidnapped his girlfriend. He went to a party. She'd broken up with him. He went to a party where he wasn't invited. He managed to find the father's rifle in a rifle cabinet and held the whole party hostage. And then ordered her to leave with him, his girlfriend, and took her in a car. Everybody called the police. The police pulled him over and arrested him. Did he get jail time? No, he got straight probation. Psychologists testified at his trial it would be psychologically damaging for him not to finish high school. So he was just required to change schools. So that was, I think, in the late 70s. Hopefully that wouldn't happen now, but you never know. So then, 3 years later, it happened again. He's in college. He's dating somebody else. She's broken up with him. He's stalking her outside of her workplace. He sees her getting into another guy's car. He approaches them and he pistol whips the other guy and orders her into his car and takes off. And again, the police pull him over and arrest him. This time he gets, I think, a 5-year sentence and ends up serving 3. 15 years later, he shoots and kills his wife with a Civil War era sidearm. His defense at his trial, this was in Malden, his defense at his trial was that steroids made him do it. He said he's an amateur bodybuilder. He said he was so jacked up on steroids. He was like super aggressive. Right? But I don't think steroids makes you drive up to York, Maine, to buy. That's legal, by the way. The guns don't even classify as in antique shops. They don't classify as firearms. So guns, if you want to kill more than one person, guns are definitely the way to go. One of the killers interviewed hid out in the basement of he broke into his estranged mother-in-law's house because his wife had fled there, hid out on Easter Eve in the basement, and then sort of sprung himself on them on Easter morning. And first he chased down the mother of the victim and pointed the gun at her and said, "Die, bitch," and shot and killed the mother. Then he chased down her sister and shot her sister, who ended up surviving. Then he shot and killed his wife. He thought it through. He wanted his wife to first suffer by seeing the death of her mother and then her sister. So the order of homicide is very significant in terms of what the mindset is of killers. That was in New Bedford. So stabbers, I asked them would they have used a gun, and 4 of them said, "Yeah, sure, it would have been easier." And 2 of them said, "Nah, I wanted to get away. The gun would have made too much noise." One of them said he didn't want to wake up his kids. I asked the stranglers, and only one of them said he would have used a gun. He said, "If I had a gun, I would have used it earlier. That's why I didn't keep one in the house." So he knew he was a jealous drunk. He knew his tendencies. He smothered her. That was in Watertown, by the way. His defense at his trial was the police had caused her death. His claim was that the police hadn't administered CPR aggressively enough. They were so intent on subduing him that she died unnecessarily. So that was his defense in his trial.
How did he do?
He was found guilty. So here's the finding about punching. These are the women I interviewed. You can see that they had been severely abused previously, most of them. It's important to ask those additional questions because that's another yes or no question on the forms, but it's important to ask the additional follow-up questions. The situation is really important. Did he start escalating? Did he start surveilling you more when you talked about leaving him, for instance? This used to be the only thing that counted. This is the only thing that counted in the criminal justice system. If he hadn't been arrested, he's good to go. It's the least significant. It's significant when it's there, by the way. But even in homicide cases, it's not there at least half the time, right? So it doesn't mean anything. Remember that drunk driving study years ago that found that the average drunk driver who's arrested for the first time has at least 30 prior incidents of drunk driving for which they were not arrested. It's got to be the same thing for domestic violence, right? So just because somebody has never been arrested does not mean he hasn't been violent. But you have defense attorneys, particularly those 3/4 of the guys that come off well, who are saying, Your Honor, my client has never been arrested, right? He has roots in the community, right? Forced sex is very significant. It's a difficult question to ask. It's important to ask the question. Not necessary for a police officer, maybe an advocate, a follow-up visit with an advocate might be the best way to do that. Stalking. So when you have a victim, we have a presentation later, so I'm not going to go over this a lot, but about stalking. But what is a victim, when you ask her about stalking, what does she usually think you're asking about? Following, yeah. Yeah, and so, but Jackie Campbell, this is Jackie Campbell's study, she found that it's not just, this is the murder versus the normal domestic violence cases. They were more likely to follow or spying. They were more likely to make unwanted phone calls. Now, how do victims think of unwanted, do they think of that as stalking? Harassment. Yeah, they think of it as harassment, right? But what is the stalking aspect of unwanted phone calls or text messaging or emails? Yeah, it's surveillance. There's a surveillance component to it. One of the victims I interviewed, no, one of the killers I interviewed, he would call her at the nursing home where she worked and ask, is Tracy there? And by the time she'd been brought to the phone, he would have hung up because he already found out what he wanted. He was trying to find out whether she was at work. He suspected she was cheating on him. Okay. Two of the killers at least lost their jobs because they were taking so much time off to stalk. Surveillance. One of them actually, unbeknownst to her, quit his job a month prior and would drive away from the house as if he was going to work, but really just park down the street and surveil her all day until he became convinced that she killed her when he became convinced. So standing outside the property, again, that might be seen as just harassment, and destroying property, that might be seen as just harassment too.
How old are these numbers? Because with iPhone, smartphones and technology, it seems worse.
We'll get to that. So somebody from the stalking resource is going to go through all those uses of technology. They kind of creep you out, but we're going to do it. So extreme jealousy, I'm going to skip through. So substance abuse, again, the frequency is important. So that when I interviewed the victims of attempted homicide, a lot of them had told me that he started using more substances. It was now daily abuse. And they said some interesting things. They said, I noticed that he started neglecting his hygiene, which in retrospect became a clue that he had no plans for the future. He was letting himself go, right? And sometimes he was saying things, see what's happened to me since you left me, right? Making her feel guilty. One of the victims that we interviewed, he convinced her that he wanted to see her one last time. He told her he's accepted the situation, and he just wanted to meet up with her. So they met up at a subway stop in Cambridge, and then he pulled out a knife and started stabbing her in the head. She survived, but what she learned later was that he had just learned that he had advanced stage liver disease because he was such a severe alcoholic. He was given 1 month to live. He actually did die a month later. So he figured he was going to take her out before he died. So asking about frequency, when it's daily abuse of substances, the odds go way up. Okay. Prior strangulation, we used to never ask about that. We never thought it was significant. It is a very significant. Talk about trial runs. When a person has got their hands around a person's throat, what are they saying when they got their hands around their throat?
Kill you, I hate you.
That's right. So the victims I interviewed, they said he was saying things like, you want it to end now or later? You want it to end slow or fast? Okay, you know I can take your life any time, right? So they literally got her life in their hands, and they're basically telling her, you know, this is what's going to happen. And we are going to have a presentation about strangulation later today. Extreme dominance, those kinds of statements, controlling her daily activities. I want to give you kind of a real quick example. One of the killers I interviewed, 6 weeks prior to killing her, he was strangling her with every intention of killing her because she had left him. This was on Cape Cod. And she saved herself by saying she would go back to him. He said what he learned from that was that he wouldn't believe her in the future. So he carefully constructed the scenario where he convinced her he just wanted to see the 2 daughters. And he knew she was deathly afraid, so could be at her parents' house with her brother present to visit. Shows up that night as if it's a date. He's got 2 videos, a family video he wants to see with her and the kids, and a sexually provocative video called Body Heat. So she and he and the brother and the girls all watch this family video together. Unfortunately, the brother then goes to bed. They put the girls to bed. She is trying to placate him at this point. She's trying to sort of like not antagonize him, you know, so she's sort of like going along. They watch this video. He's plying her with alcohol, knowing that she tends to fall asleep. She has sex with him, and she says, "I'm tired. I'm going to go to bed. You let yourself out." So she's trying to placate him. But instead, he puts the 2 girls, takes the girls, and puts them in his car, then goes into the bedroom and stabs her in the neck. And watching show with baseball. He said to me, having sex was important with her because he wanted the other guy, he assumed there was another guy in her life, he wanted the other guy to know that I was the last to have it. We're talking about ownership, right? It was a way of sealing us together as a couple forever, he said. Okay. One of the questionnaires I gave all the killers these attitude questionnaires, and one of them was, it's called Attitudes Towards Wife Beating, and one of the questions is, if a wife cheats on her husband, she deserves to be beaten. How much do you agree with that? He got to that and he said, what if you don't think she should be beaten, but she should be killed? And I said, what is the difference in your mind? And he said, I didn't want to hurt her. That's why I waited for her to fall asleep before I killed her. But I had explained to her repeatedly that if she cheated on me or left me, I would kill her. I had told her many, many times. So why would she do that? He said. He was confused. Like, this is 7 years later. He's still confused by that. Why would she cause her own death? The most sickening thing about that case is that the maternal grandparents are still to this day required to bring the 2 girls to prison to visit them. The law that was passed that prohibits that for first and second degree is not retroactive to that case. He's very smug about it too, by the way. He said, you know, I think they're finally coming around. They're understanding where it's coming from. Can you imagine? The murder victim's parents are required to bring these 2 girls to visit him in prison. So here's the 5 types of killers. I mentioned jealous types, most common type. 65. So according to the victims I interviewed, 95% fit that profile. 90% mean. According to murderers, 65% of them sort of tested out as being extremely jealous. What they have in common is that they tend to be very dependent on the victim. They tend to engage in a lot of surveillance activities throughout the relationship. It is not the way the media presents. How does the media present a jealous husband who kills his wife? Desperate husband snaps. Troubled relationship ends tragically. Those are the headlines. What picture do you get from that? Something unusual. This poor person snapped, you know, was tested to the limits. Is that the case? Nope. I found that I interviewed them, not just their whole relationship, but their prior relationships. These guys have always been extremely jealous. Always. One of the killers, 2 previous wives had fled the country. So their jealousy had always been a toxic presence in their relationship. And of course, when you're extremely jealous, you keep proving your own point, right? Because victims seek relief, they seek separation, they seek solace from other people when they're always being asked thousands of questions, they're always being smothered, and that just proves their point. Well, she must be seeing somebody. Right? And so that's the most common type of killer. What prompts them to kill is estrangement, usually. Then you have substance abusers. So most of the substance abusers are also jealous, and most of the jealous guys are also substance abusers. The substance use tends to fuel their jealous ruminations, by the way. And so look at this, though. One of the interesting things is they had very short courtships. So these guys have an average courtship of 2 months, and for a third of them it's 1 month. Why do they rush their courtship so much? So the courtship is the time you meet to the time you start living together. So why do they move so fast? These guys.
To find out about what they're really like.
Yeah, so God's saying that they're afraid the victim, if they give her more time, she's going to find out about his past. These guys have a lot to hide. They've got pending restraining orders against them. They've got pending arrests against them. They don't want to give her the time to find that out. And the way that they meet women is really interesting. You know, they see themselves as rescuers of women. One of the men met her on a city bus in Springfield, and he just happened to sit next to her, and he struck up a conversation, and she revealed to him that her parents had kicked her out of the house because she was pregnant, and he's like Johnny on the spot, saying, "You can live with me." And so she moved in with him 2 days later. Right? So these guys see themselves as rescuers of women in distress. Right? Another very common thing, we do this in our agency, my agency, we do relationship histories. Meeting in an AA meeting, come along to fix your car. That's a very, very common thing. Come along to fix your car. It won't start. So an AA meeting is that she's on the rebound from another bad relationship, so he's like Johnny on the spot, right? And so these guys see themselves as rescuers of women. And the first order of business is to get her hooked. Get her. Most of the victims did not have a history of substance use. But after they met these guys, they did, for the most part, so that they would basically induct her into his lifestyle. All of her friends were his drinking and drugging friends now. She lost a lot of her normal sources of support. She lost a lot of credibility, right? Because if you leave me, I'm going to say that you're using cocaine, right? A couple of the victims I interviewed, the batterer was actually her pimp and her supplier. So that they have this blackmail that they can now use against her. It doesn't count against him, you know. He's not troubled by his own alcohol and drug use, but it's certainly something that can count against her as a mother. And so what triggered the actual homicide for the jealous drunks was anything, any kind of normal argument, anything that pissed him off could trigger it. One of the guys, she was yelling at him because he clogged up the toilet from throwing macaroni in the toilet. And so he was trying to unclog it with a broom handle. And she yelled at him, and he punched her in the face, and she died of an aneurysm 10 days later. I asked the victims, tell me about the attempted homicide of these guys. They say, which one? Because they had had so many close calls with these women. They had had so many crazy scenes that easily could have resulted in their death previously. There was arguable, which is the most serious. Which brings me to the philosophy of these guys, substance abusers. They have this philosophy that I've come to call shit happens. So that I used to work with young men in substance abuse in Quincy, and they were all arrested for vandalism or drunk driving, and every week they tell me their crazy stories about the latest crazy shit that had happened to them. And it was, Dave, I was standing by the side of a highway and a car struck me. Hilarious. You ever think about not standing on the highway, right? But for them, it was like hilarious. All of these exciting things that would happen to them, these death wish kinds of things that were always happening to them. Well, the murderers were saying the same thing. They were saying, we were arguing in the car, and I got a little crazy, and I pushed her out of the car. Hilarious. Or I was driving, we were arguing, and I threw myself out of the car. Hilarious. Or we were arguing in the car, and I crashed into some gas pumps, and the whole gas station went up in a blaze. Hilarious. I got a little crazy jealous, and I started hitting her over her head with a lead pipe. Hilarious. So to them, this is just a reflection of how much passion they have, that all of this crazy stuff happens to them all the time. They're not ashamed of it at all. It's a point of pride for them. And it shows how much passion they have. And we've stood by each other through thick and thin. This was the other thing that we say a lot. Okay. So that I'm going to really go fast here. I'm going to talk about, I'm going to skip by the depressed suicidal. I'm going to talk about materially motivated. These guys don't get jealous because they're not into any one woman. There's actually two types. There's one type that serially exploits women. They basically move from one woman, mooching off of them. You know, their biggest complaint and the biggest reason for killing that they stated was, she bothered me. She was always getting in my business, right? So they want to be able to come and go, have lots of women without being bothered by any one woman. Okay. So then the other type is not exploitive. They're gainfully employed, but they're obsessed with money and they're obsessed with reputation. They're not upset about losing their wife. They're upset about losing the material assets of the marriage. They feel like they're going to lose their reputation because they like being successfully married. They're going to lose their house. One of them owned a pizza shop. He felt he'd been screwed out of his share of the pizza business, which had been in her business, by the way. He walked into the pizza shop and shot her 6 times, point blank. Her sister, who also worked in the shop, jumped on him when he was shooting her sister, and he pointed the gun to her and pulled the trigger, but he was out of bullets at that point. So these guys don't get jealous. They hate women. They tend to think of women as being, you know, bloodsuckers, basically, and they're obsessed with money and reputation. They tend to have lots of secrets, by the way. They tend to have affairs. A lot of what triggers the homicide, actually, is her discovery of the secrets, too, by the way. Internet porn, having affairs, and so forth. And criminal types, I'm going to go by that a little bit. You can sort of read about it since I'm running short of time. I want to talk about double threats. So most of the killers were more than one. So the most common combination was a jealous drunk. And that may actually be the thing, the tipping point for these guys, just being jealous, but then being an alcoholic on top of that may be the tipping point. Okay? Those are other common combinations. I wanted to sort of end with giving you some examples. So here's James. I asked him, what would make you jealous? He said, well, to be honest, I'm not that jealous. I guess if I was drinking, that would make me more so. You know, the insecurity would kick in, and then I'd be saying some real shit. Are you saying that when you're drinking, you would think things that you normally would not think? He said, yeah, you could say that. I'd be thinking a lot of things. Yes, sick shit. Well, like what? Well, like her and her father. You mean you'd be thinking Kareem was sexually involved with her father? Yeah, I might have accused her of that a couple of times if I had some alcohol in me. Did you really believe that? No, not regularly, no. But again, if I was drinking, yes. Okay, so we've talked about crazy shit, and now we've heard about sick shit. This is actually a serious question. What is the difference between crazy shit and sick shit? Any ideas about that?
Maybe crazy was something that probably couldn't happen, but a sick shit could.
No. What's the difference between crazy shit and sick shit? There was some joker a police officer who said a sick shit is when you get like you have food poisoning. That's not what I'm looking for. Yeah, I've done a lot of crazy shit, and that's hilarious. I've done some sick shit, but I'm not talking about that. In my experience, sick shit almost always involves sexual abuse of a child. Almost always when a person uses that phrase, they're talking about sexual abuse of a child. So it's almost like code for them. So even they know that's bad. Okay. And so that's the difference. And so the thing I want to end with is the significance of this. So that the first rule of fighting terrorism is what? what's the most important thing in terms of fighting terrorism? Yeah, is intelligence. Gathering intelligence about the terrorists, right? So what do we know? What are their grievances, right? So that victims have a lot of information about their terrorist. What are his prior grievances? What are the things that sort of like set him off? Is it money? Is it jealousy? You know, is he depressed? Okay. Is he being bothered by her getting into his business? Okay, so what are the triggers? Potential triggers in that case. That's really important. And so we need to gather better intelligence about the part of the problem that's going to cause the problem. We know a lot about the victim, but what do we know about the perpetrator, right? And so we need to have all of those things. And victims are really great sources of information about them. We need to collect that information safely, though, and Maria and Maureen are going to talk about that in a bit. And so, what are the differences between abusers who kill and those that don't kill? Most abusers, believe it or not, do move on with their lives. Right? They get restraining orders, they might violate them even, but eventually they get it, they move on with their lives. Okay? They don't necessarily stop being abusive, by the way. Okay? Sometimes they do. I think pattern intervention helps. But then you have this very small percentage. So we've got 30,000 restraining orders a year. Last year we had 10 homicides. That's a tiny percentage. But then for every actual homicide, about 9 times as many cases have the same characteristics. So we need to do better at sorting these cases and recognizing the cases that have the highest potential. And so there are a lot of things that sort of increase the odds. And all of those things are listed there. They're increase the odds. So that's my book, by the way. I brought a couple of them if you're interested. But any questions or comments? Okay, so we're going to take a 15-minute break. Thank you.